There is rising concern, of course, about the situation in Syria, and I think anyone who tries to follow the tea leaves of American policy sees that it is evolving with the passage of time. One of the core questions about the direction of American policy concerns the nature of the Syrian opposition, the nature of the Free Syrian Army, what constitutes the Free Syrian Army. Is it indeed a military force, a single unitary force? Who is the opposition? What are its goals? What's its connection to the political opposition, the Syrian National Council? And what do we even call what is going on in Syria today? Is this a rebellion, an insurrection, an uprising, a civil war? To help us understand the military assessment of the situation in Syria today, I think we're very fortunate to have a panel of two of Washington's finest professional military analysts. On my left is Jeff White. Jeff is a defense fellow here at the Washington Institute, joined us after 35 years in the Defense Intelligence Agency, during which he managed and directed the agency's work on Middle East issues. Jeff has been following with granular detail the evolution of the military conflict in Syria, and especially the growth and development of the Free Syrian Army. And he'll be offering his assessment first of the situation on the ground with the Free Syrian Army. And after Jeff speaks, I will have the pleasure of turning to Andrew Exum, who's sitting on my right. Andrew is a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. He's editor of the blog Abu Mukawama, which if any of you who speak Arabic know what that means. If you don't, then I won't tell you. He's the author of This Man's Army, A Soldier's Story from the Front Lines of the War on Terror. He himself is, of course, a former serving officer in the Army Rangers in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had the pleasure of having Andrew as a fellow of the Washington Institute earlier in his career, and we're very proud that he's gone off to continue to do great things. So first, I will turn to Jeff, and then to Andrew, and then to your questions. And hopefully, at the end of this session, we'll all have, and hopefully Washington will have, a better understanding of the actual military situation on the ground in Syria. Jeff.
Well, thank you all for coming, and hope you enjoy what we have to say here. Timing was certainly good. Just to make a couple of introductory comments at the start, the FSA is not a static thing at all, right? It's evolving along with the situation in Syria. It's changed the nature of the conflict there, and it will continue to do so. If and as its capabilities improve, its influence on the situation and how the situation develops is going to grow. It's not a perfect armed instrument, right? And nor should we expect it to be at this point. It's a developing, emerging instrument, not a fully developed one. In my mind, sort of in a truth in advertising sense, it's worthy of support, lethal and non-lethal, and assistance in becoming better organized and more effective. So that's basically my sort of policy position on the FSA. Just a note on methodology. When I look at the FSA and examining it and all the issues around it, I see this as a traditional military capabilities and order of battle analysis problem. There's no magic here. It's basically developing a story, an assessment, an order of battle for the FSA. The sources I'm using, which are all unclassified, no government information. I'm looking at web pages associated with the FSA and the popular opposition. Facebook pages, including Facebook pages for a number of the FSA formations and units. And there's about 40 websites and Facebook pages that I'm looking at over time or continuously, whatever. I'm also looking at YouTube a lot. YouTube provides a very great deal of military relevant information, as do these other sources. And I'm reading what journalists are reporting about their contacts with the FSA. So it's basically some essentially basic sources. And then I'm analyzing clash data. This is reports of clashes between the FSA forces, battalions, and regime forces. And I'm using the Syrian Observatory on Human Rights reporting on that and the local coordinating committees reporting. So this gives me two sources that are basically reporting continuously on clashes, along with a lot of other activity. And you can get a lot of military relevant information from looking at that data. Again, it's not magic. This is traditional kind of work. So to go back just a little bit of time, what I'm talking about is my main topic is the FSA in early April, but it's important, I think, to go back to January to get an idea of where we've come at least since January. As of late January, the way I see it, the FSA was sort of at a high water mark. All right, they made substantial gains against the regime. They wrested control or partial control of Zabadani, Homs, Rostan, the Damascus suburbs, parts of Idlib from the regime. Basically, were present there and visibly present in all those areas. Clashes between the FSA and regime forces were increasing towards the end of January. By my count, by the method I use, I counted 115 reported clashes in January. Again, I'm using the sources that I'm talking about. And also we saw a increase in the number of FSA formations. Now, back in the summer or fall, the FSA came out and said we have 22 battalions, but we're seeing the continuous emergence of formations associated with the FSA. The FSA publicly paraded in a number of places in January. They were seen in the streets to the acclaim of the population shouting, their honor to them and all that, and they were literally out in the streets. And basically, the regime appeared on the defensive, kind of on its heels in this situation. But beginning in late January, the regime launched a sustained offensive against the FSA. And we're still seeing that play out to some extent. They operated in areas which the FSA had, in a sense, taken to destroy FSA formations, to punish the people that supported the FSA, and basically to regain these areas. The one way to look at it is that with the withdrawal of the Arab League monitors at the end of January and the veto of the UN resolution in early February, Bashar and his regime felt kind of emboldened, free, basically, to act against the FSA. Now, beginning in January or late January and into February, the regime forces successfully reclaimed the Damascus suburbs, Zabadani, Bab al-Amr, and Homs, and portions of Idlib province. They used, in some cases, divisional-sized forces to take or retake these areas, while they conducted suppression operations to hold down the FSA and the opposition in Dara, Hama, Aleppo, and Dar Azwar. In no case was the FSA able to prevent the regime from carrying out its operations. The regime went ahead and did it, despite, in some cases, where the FSA did resist. Now, these successes by the regime forces in late January and early February, they produced a lot of media headlines proclaiming the rout, demoralization, ineffectiveness, and basically the defeat of the FSA. And that was sort of the story emerging in the mainstream media. However, I think this is a deeper story than that. The FSA was able to inflict damage and some losses on regime forces. It was able to avoid the destruction of its own FSA formations. So it was able to escape large-scale and significant losses. The fighting of the winter exposed the regime's inability to conduct more than one or two large-scale operations at a time. And in addition, the FSA forced the regime to escalate the level of violence, to employ more violence, to use heavier weaponry, and to expose itself to the international community. Okay, so that's the backdrop heading into late March and early April. So what does the FSA sort of look like, today? Well, in March, the FSA began to rebound. And what I saw was a significant decline in activity by the FSA in February, but then a very significant rebound beginning in March and continuing till now. So the FSA, far from being vanquished or whatever, is definitely back in the game as of early April. So in terms of forces, I'm going to work through what the FSA kind of looks like here. In terms of forces, when I look at the order of battle of the FSA, I count 68 named battalions. Okay. Now these battalions is a better term for this in a sense maybe formations, right? Because these are different sizes and so on. 27 of those I treat as high confidence, right? They look real good that they actually exist. 27 medium confidence and 14 low confidence. And the trend I'm seeing is that it moves, as I pick up a unit, it moves from low confidence to medium confidence to high confidence. So my sense is that they're getting bigger. I have a working list of 150 formations for the FSA, right? And that's probably conservative now because I stopped counting them because I had to do something else like in late March. And what I see is new formations come out all the time. But if you count the 68 named battalions that I have in my list, and you figure, strength of these formations from 50 to 200 people, it gives you a range of about 3,400 or 3,000, let's say, to 14,000 people. Now that's a big range, right? But I think it kind of reflects, there aren't 200 guys in every FSA battalion, right? So it's somewhere between 3 and 14,000 in these battalions. Now, there are a number of local defense groups, other formations, people with guns, that I'm not counting as actually FSA order battle, but they're out there and apparently active in resistance. And what we hear is there are tens of thousands of people waiting to join the FSA if they had weapons. Okay, now, is that true or not? I don't know, but there doesn't seem to be any problem with FSA formations or these other formations gaining people and being able to conduct some kind of operations or activity. The weapons we see are overwhelmingly of Soviet or Warsaw Pact, whatever you want to call it, design. Right? These are the AK-47s, typical Soviet-era small arms. Right? We see RPGs, of course, they're ubiquitous. We've seen a little bit of evidence of RPG-29, which is an advanced RPG. We see ATGMs now, anti-tank guided missiles, the Metis M and Cornet, and maybe even some other types. We see 107 millimeter recoilless rifles and some mortars. Right? We see a few M16 type weapons. I've seen an M2 heavy machine gun, and don't know where that came from, but they've had it. Or they have it. They're also now using armored vehicles from defectors. You see a number of cases now where when there's a defection from the regime forces, they take their vehicles with them. Now, we don't see any armored formations of the FSA. There's no 1st Armored Brigade or Battalion of the FSA, but they do employ these sometimes. We saw them used in Homs for sure and in a few other places. So they're using those. And we also see them going sort of down the Libyan route of mounting weapons on pickup trucks, Nissan pickup trucks, whatever. And they're mounting medium-type machine guns or general-purpose type machine guns. And I've seen a recoilless rifle on one of these, or on one of these kinds of vehicles. So we're seeing a little bit of that. Incidentally, the regime is doing the same thing. We're now seeing Shahiba elements with 23 millimeter anti-aircraft weapons mounted on pickup trucks. So they're giving Shahiba a little more firepower. We're also seeing now that higher than battalion level formations are beginning to appear. This is an important stage in the development of the FSA. From just a bunch of separate battalions, we're now beginning to see brigade formations. We have the Free Brigade of the North, or the Brigade of the Free North in Aleppo, the Jafar el-Tayyar Brigade in Dar ez-Zawar, 111th Brigade also supposedly in Dar ez-Zawar, and so on. And we're also seeing now the appearance of a number of revolutionary military councils in Khan Shaykhun, Aleppo, Dara, and Hama. Now this is providing local, provincial, or city-wide military, potentially command and control, or at least a structure above the battalion level, and between whatever the FSA headquarters is in Turkey, right? So this is a significant development. So for some gains, the FSA, or successes, whatever positive elements for the FSA. The first thing I'd say is the FSA still has the continued support of the population. This is maybe the center of gravity for the whole rebellion against the regime. Is the willingness of the people to cooperate and support the FSA, and the reverse, the FSA to cooperate with them and support them. Despite whatever the regime has done, there's little evidence that the population has deserted the FSA. What you see is frequently in our demonstrations in which the people are shouting for a number of things, but one of them is support for the FSA. So you see, visible signs of this kind of support. We also see this increasing organization and a greater level of cooperation between and among FSA units. So you now have multiple battalion operations, or operations involving multiple elements of several different battalions. Now, to go back to this issue of the proliferation of units within the FSA, between the beginning of February and mid-March, let's say, I counted 60 new formations. Right? And this is what I could pick up, from the various reporting sources I have. And I don't pretend that that's all inclusive, right? I think there's probably more formations that I simply missed. But there is this a continuing process. In fact, I saw a couple new ones even today. This continuing process of new formations showing up. And very importantly, we're seeing the stream of defections continues, right? There's no, it's hard to track, unless you put a real focused effort on it, it's hard to track, how big this stream of defections is. But we see a continuous stream of defections from the regime forces. And we're up to like 8 or 9 brigadier generals, plus everybody below that having defected from the regime. No major generals yet that I've been able to see. Also for the FSA, we have identifiable commanders, right? And we have formations with a combat record. That is, these formations are not a mystery in a sense. We actually see. You can look at some of them and see a track record of operations, going back into November, December. You can see commanders that appear in these videos that are released, and so on. The FSA is also learning how to fight, I think. They conduct a number of different kinds of actions. They attack exposed posts and positions of the regime, especially checkpoints are one of their favorites. They ambush vehicles and convoys regularly of the regime. Saw some more of those today. They conduct targeted killings of regime military officers. They know down to the captain, lieutenant level within the regime who's killing civilians. Right? So they've identified a number of regime officers that are involved in suppression and killing of civilians. And when they can, they kill these guys or try to kill them. They engage in the cutting and harassment of lines of communication. They blew up an overpass down in Dara province. They understand the importance of the regime, the mobility of its forces, and they attempt to interfere with that. And I saw yesterday, at least, or maybe this morning, that they reported shooting down a helicopter. The Syrian government's use of combat aviation, attack helicopters, combat helicopters, is steadily increasing. It's no longer a secret. They're using it all over the country, and it's in an attack role. It's not just moving stuff around. That should be, in my mind, that should be getting a lot more attention. The kinds of weapons we see them employing and using, more and more effectively are IEDs and mines. They use the IEDs offensively in ambushes, and it looks just like the stuff we used to see in Iraq. But they also use IED mines in defensive areas where they're trying to protect the population group. They will put out mines and IEDs to protect the population. And we're now seeing evidence that they have heavy machine guns. This is a step up. This is the so-called dushkas, the 12.7 or 14.7 millimeter machine guns, heavy machine guns. They will bring down a helicopter, and we now see formations showing up with them. The FSA is also, as I indicated before, very resilient. It's able to avoid destruction of its formations and come back and fight. In most areas, including even Zabadani and Homs, even where the regime, or especially in Dara, let's say, even where the regime proclaims a success in clearing or chasing out the FSA, inevitably the FSA formations move back into the area and take up operations again. There is no clearing, no permanent clearing of an area by the regime so far. And I don't think it'll happen. Now, what's the scope of the activity and the presence of FSA formations? Now, by my count, by what I look at, there's armed opposition forces in at least 11 of the 14 provinces and probably 12 of the 14 provinces. So they are basically spread now throughout the country. Where we see the most activity is in the Damascus countryside, Idlib and Dara. But Dar Zawar province and Aleppo are also seeing increasing activity and increasing presence of FSA formations. They correlate. When I counted up the specific locations for clashes in March, I saw 60-some specific locations where there were clashes between FSA elements and regime elements in March alone. And I had a total of 135 reported clashes in March. So this exceeds the previous high level, by my count, that occurred in January. So the regime's winter offensive suppressed, pushed the activity down in February, but the level of activity has bounced up, I think, even higher than in March. Okay, the FSA is not 10 feet tall. It's got problems, right? And when you look at one side of a conflict like we're doing today, there's a tendency maybe to exaggerate them, right? So, but the FSA has issues and problems it has to deal with. Basically, for the FSA units, it's a question of men against fire, right? The regime has the armor, it's got the artillery, which is increasingly employing, and it's got combat aviation, which is now using. So that's what the FSA is up against in simple military terms. It still has issues with command and control, even though there's been some progress. They have all these formations need to be integrated into a coherent effort, and coordinating across a large city or across a province remains, I think, a challenge for them, although they're getting somewhat better at it. FSA forces are not field forces. They're local forces. They're not readily deployable across a province or from one part of the country to the other. There's some indication that that's improving a little bit. They have some tactical mobility. They move people in pickup trucks from one point to another. So that gives, but that's usually within a city or within a small area. But they do have some tactical mobility. I think a major problem for the FSA is the vulnerability of the population. If you posit that the FSA relationship with the people is critical, the people are under a lot of pressure. Right? The regime's attacks on the people have the potential, anyway, to strain, I think, that critical relationship. So far, it hasn't been able to do that. Hasn't been able to break that connection. So what are the requirements for the FSA to stay in the fight or get better? Well, it needs appropriate weapons and equipment. It doesn't have all the kinds of equipment it needs. It has some good equipment, but it needs more of that. Very importantly, it needs an assured supply of ammunition. It doesn't have that. Some FSA units have apparently run out of ammunition in various battles, and so on. The regime is broadening its attack on the people, right? And it's moving essentially what looks like a scorched earth campaign in some areas. It's burning the houses, the shops, the vehicles of people in these areas of opposition, in addition to sort of killing them as it's traditionally done. But it's changed, upped its pressure, I think, on the population. The LCC put out a report the other day on Idlib when it said that, I mean, you can believe this or not, but in Jebel Zawiya, the security forces in Shibia burned 52 houses in one town. Okay, that's getting up there in terms of scorched earth, kind of things. So if you're thinking about the FSA, how do you measure the effectiveness of the FSA? What you have to think about when you're saying, okay, are these guys any good or not? Well, I think they're direct measures, and they basically relate to what does the FSA actually do? What can we see it do? And that includes trends in the effectiveness of the FSA, its growth, and its organizational coherence. We can look at what kinds of operations and actions it takes and what scale those operations or actions are taking place on. They seem to be getting bigger and in more places. And we can look at damage inflicted on regime forces, equipment and personnel. The damage the FSA seems to be doing increasing damage to regime forces. And it's part of the reason we see the regime employing artillery so freely now, and they've introduced now the combat helicopters into the action. Regime forces are getting, I think, more careful about willingness to go into a city or town that hasn't been prepared by extensive bombardment, essentially, and siege. So the FSA looks like it's getting better than that. Don't have exact data, but you can see a lot of burning equipment, lots of reports of regime personnel killed, and so on. Now the indirect measures are. One indirect measure of FSA effectiveness is what kind of reaction is it drawn from the regime. And what we see over the months since the FSA was formed, we see the regime reacting more and more strongly to FSA operations and activity. The regime has had to continuously escalate its military operations against the FSA, and that's an indication that the FSA is effective and a danger to the regime. I'll just talk a little bit here at the end about the prospects for escalation of the conflict. It's not over, and the prospects, I think, are excellent that it will escalate. It's already escalating horizontally and vertically. More places are horizontally. There's more places involved in clashes between the FSA and the regime. And vertical escalation relates to the nature of weaponry that's being used, and clearly that's escalating on the regime's part. The regime is going deeper into its arsenal. Employment of field artillery was an escalation. Now we have the combat helicopters, and this suggests to me that the regime is not interested maybe in a security solution. Definitely not interested in a political solution. People have talked about a security solution. But what I see is the regime is looking for a firepower solution. Right? They intend to crush the opposition, basically with firepower. On the other hand, the FSA is getting bigger, and it's learning how to fight and so on. So, those two things, the regime's willingness to fight harder, do more to suppress the FSA, and the FSA's growth and so on, suggests that the fighting is going to get basically worse. So I think I should quit on that note and turn it over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Andrew?
Yeah. Hey, first off, let me just thank Rob and Jeff for this invitation. It's great to be back here. It's also great to be responding to the master himself on this issue. So I'm going to try to hold my own, but there are several reasons for a little humility from we analysts looking at this problem set. The first off, and this is personal, there's been some great reporting that's been an analysis that's already been done on this conflict. Jeff has done some. Joe Holliday and Bailey O'Baggy have done some for the Institute for Study of War. Nir Rosen's done some good reporting for Jazeera from Syria. And I can't hope to match the reporting and analysis that those folks have done. The second thing is, I am by no means a Syria expert. I wrote my dissertation on the fighting in southern Lebanon in the 1990s. That's right next door, but each of these conflicts are sui generis. They all come from a very specific social, political, cultural milieu. And I'm not gonna. I look around, I see Moni Yakubian and Dave Schenker, and these are real Syria experts, and I can't compete with those folks. The second reason to be a little bit humble about what we can say is going on in Syria is that we've even though we've been blessed with some dispassionate analysis, it's been difficult to get dispassionate reporting from the ground. A lot of the sources that we have for what's going on in Syria come from interested parties, either from the regime or from the FSA or from various Syrian opposition groups, all of whom have a direct interest in misrepresenting their relative strength as well as what's taking place on the ground. And then third and finally, I agree with Jeff that this is an order of battle problem. But I thought the same thing about Libya, and I approached it in such a way. And I remember looking at the Libya problem set last summer, and looking through kind of the order of battle and thinking, well, this is not looking good for the rebels. This is probably going to be a very protracted civil war. And sure enough, a week later, Tripoli fell. And so that was a humbling experience for me. Again, if I look at the order of battle just with respect to Syria. Upwards of 600,000 men under arms, 5,000 main battle tanks, 1,500 APCs, 3,400 pieces of artillery. Not looking good for the rebels, just in terms of just looking at the equipment and personnel that's on the ground. But of course, there are a lot of things that we can't see. In Libya, we saw the equipment that various sides had, and we had some reporting from the perspective of the Libyan rebels who were improving but were kind of ramshackle. What we weren't able to see is the status of the Gaddafi fighters in Libya. So we didn't have any reporting from people like Chris Shivers at the New York Times on what was going on inside Gaddafi's ranks. In the same way, with respect to Syria, Bashar al-Assad has a massive military apparatus, but there's an argument to be made that using that apparatus and the continual use of that military carries with it a cost. And I'm not sure, maybe you can measure that cost in defections among officers. Maybe you can measure that cost, materially in terms of, battle damage. But I'm not sure what the cost is in terms of the morale, in terms of the overall combat effectiveness of those fighting forces. So with that with those three huge caveats, let me I'm going to do two things here. First off, I'm going to frame the conflict in Libya in kind of broader terms as we look at, we may not have a perfect vision of what's going on inside Syria, but we do have a lot of literature on civil wars and insurgencies, which I think is relevant here. And then the second thing, I'm going to tie this into where I think U.S. interests are going forward and what's keeping policymakers up at night. Okay, first off, there's been some reluctance actually on the part of the Syrian rebels to claim themselves as an insurgency. That term used to be thought as kind of that's a nice term. You want to be called an insurgent, not a terrorist. It's not as pejorative as terrorist, but because of the fighting in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Afghanistan, I think there's some wariness of claiming the mantle of an insurgency. But here's how the U.S. military defines an insurgency: an organized movement aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. An organized, protracted political military struggle designed to weaken the control and legitimacy of an established government occupying power or other political authority while increasing insurgent control. I think it's pretty clear that what's taking place, to describe the Syrian opposition as an insurgency, I think is a fair assessment. Good news, bad news. We Americans have learned a lot about insurgencies the hard way over the past decade. The U.S. military has learned a lot. But in addition, over the past decade, we've seen an explosion in civil war studies and in insurgency studies. If you were to go to the International Studies Association conference 12 years ago, you might have had one paper on insurgency or counterinsurgency or civil wars. Now, the field is just flooded with new research. And so we know a lot about civil wars and insurgencies in general. First off, they're very common. If you look at the Correlates of War database that looks at conflicts since the end of the Napoleonic era, 83% of all conflicts have not been the interstate wars that we tend to associate in our popular imagination, but have actually been civil wars and insurgencies. Second, they're protracted. In 2010, the Rand Corporation looked at 89 different examples of insurgencies, and the average length of these insurgencies was about 10 years. Complicating that is insurgents, even when they're defeated, tend to lose very slowly. Now, why is that? Well, one of their key advantages is low visibility. And as they're attrited, as their numbers go down, that advantage goes up. So they become less visible as they go up over time, which demonstrates why even a country like Iraq, which for all intents and purposes has defeated its insurgency, still is facing levels of conflict. 80% of campaigns are usually won by the government, but that's a little bit skewed in favor of the Syrians, not in favor of the United States. When the United States, tend to fight these types of campaigns against insurgencies, we usually fight as third parties on behalf of a host nation. Those are very difficult to win. And governments that are fighting on their home territory, like the British in Northern Ireland, the odds favor them much more. And there are a couple of things that I want to draw out in terms of what each side is trying to do in this type of conflict. Each side, for all intents and purposes, is trying to establish a normative system of control. I was encouraged by what Jeff said, when he talked about the fact that right now it looks as if the insurgents in Syria have are winning cooperation from the population. Because what matters for us, whether we're analyzing this as an insurgent or a counterinsurgent, is not so much your loyalty, your pre-war political preferences. So, if all things are equal, would you vote for Bashar al-Assad or would you vote for, the opposition? That doesn't really matter. What matters to us is your loyalty as expressed through your behavior. In this case, a population in a civil war is just trying to survive. And they're going to survive by being passive. They'll survive by swinging back and forth. They'll survive by hedging. So, in southern Afghanistan, we have families where they send one son to join the Taliban, one son to join the ANA, the Afghan National Army. In southern Lebanon, you'd have one son join Amal, one son join Hezbollah, one son join the southern Lebanese army. This is common behavior among populations. And what both you'll have populations that are trying to survive by kind of autarky, just kind of if any of you watch The Wire, the character Omar in The Wire is a great example of this. He's just kind of out on his own. And what both the insurgent and the counterinsurgent, both the government and the opposition are trying to do is they're trying to get people to choose sides. And when we talk about hearts and minds in this type of campaign, we're not talking about passing out Snickers bars on a corner. What we're talking about is trying to convince the population that it's in their cold, hard, best interests to support one side because their long-term interests are met through collaboration. Just one, I'm going to give one more caveat as we talk about these types of conflicts. There is, when people talk about the Lebanese Civil War, Hassan Twaini one time wrote that the Lebanese Civil War was Harb al-Akhrin, the war on behalf of the others. Lebanese sometimes forget the lam and Harb al-Akhrin, war of the others, as if no Lebanese actually fought in that war. And it's a trick of the historical memory. But Syria, in the same way, kind of risks being a proxy war. And there are a couple things to remember about civil wars and insurgencies, when they're supported by external factors. So it'd be one thing if this drama in Syria were playing out just in a vacuum. But it's not, of course. And even if we don't arm and train the FSA or the Syrian opposition, other groups are going to. And even if we can convince Russia not to support the Syrian government, Iran will. So there are other factors at play. Key things to remember here, and this comes from a Accountable Liberty study in 2010. Inconsistent international support for either side normally presages defeat. So an insurgent group that for whom international support dries up, is really almost doomed. And then I'm going to end with two more things. And I think these are the two considerations that are driving the administration. Oftentimes, when we look at this from kind of a detached perspective, just from a strategic perspective, wow, that would be great to be a tremendous blow against the Iranian regime, against the kind of the muqawama, the resistance axis. If you were to be able to decapitate, maybe not literally, of course, the al-Assad regime, or maybe literally. But the reality is, I think the worries are a little bit more immediate. First off, Syria. I was part of the great treasure hunt for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003. It was unsuccessful. In Syria, however, when we look at weapons of mass destruction, specifically chemical and biological weapons, it's not a notional prospect. Okay, they're out there. Like any good government, they've dispersed those weapons throughout the countryside. So when you think about how this conflict is going to play out, I think that one thing that's keeping the administration up at night are the presence of those chemical and biological weapons. And this also comes into something that Joe Holliday wrote about in his report. The foreign fighters in Al-Qaeda. When you look at the presence of foreign fighters or Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in Syria, this obviously is a worry for not just the United States but also the Jordanians. And the Lebanese, the Turks, and of course the Israelis. Along the same lines, when you look at how this conflict could spill over into other countries, the two countries you'd worry about most, of course, would be Iraq, which has just recently come out of its own nasty sectarian civil war, and then Lebanon. And the way I think that things would spill over in Lebanon is not starting a new Lebanese civil war up again, because again the balance of power is pretty well established in Lebanon. But where we've seen, there have been times, in 2007 is a great example, when either the Syrian government released or Shakar al-Absi escaped from Syrian detention and ended up in the Nahr al-Bared refugee camp in northern Lebanon, and we saw a pitched battle between Fatah al-Islam and the Lebanese security forces over the course of the summer of 2007, with pretty disastrous effects for the Palestinian refugees in that camp and also for the Lebanese of northern Lebanon. That, I think, is how you'd worry about this type of spillover in a place like Lebanon. And then second, and this is the most obvious thing, the administration has said that Bashar al-Assad is going. They've been very clear about it, and yet the future that I've just sketched out for you is that even if the insurgency loses, it's going to take a long, long time. If they win, it could take a similarly long time. And the longer that that Bashar al-Assad is in power, and yet, against the fact that the international community has demanded that he will go, I think that that's going to weigh heavily on administration, concerns with respect to the international community and U.S. policy in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, both of you, thank you. Let me open up a discussion session by asking you, Jeff, about one of the items that Andrew raised, which is the presence of foreign fighters, Al-Qaeda, jihadists, Salafis, etc., among the Syrian opposition. What does your assessment tell you about this element of the Syrian opposition? If you can, gentlemen, let's make comments from up here, please.
Sure. Well, I don't see a lot of it, right? There's been a lot of reporting about Salafists, jihadists, Al-Qaeda active in the armed opposition. I just don't see a lot of clear evidence of it from what I look at. I'm not denying that there aren't, some Salafists or whatever inside Free Syrian Army units, and there's like 7 different formations or battalions that I'm looking at that, maybe, could be out of the 68 that I'm carrying, or actually even out of a higher figure. But I just don't see a lot of it. You see some attacks, actions, terrorist-type bombings that have occurred in Aleppo and Damascus that sort of have the fingerprints or MO of stuff we've seen out of Al-Qaeda and various other kinds of groups coming out of Iraq and so on. But to even come close to the notion that the Salafist, jihadist, al-Qaeda groups are the dominant element within the armed opposition is basically, I think, wrong. Maybe some of it, but it's certainly not the dominant trend amongst the FSA units. Most FSA units, and I look at what they say in their statements and so on, they're talking about fighting for the people. They're talk about fighting to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. They're talking about fighting for the future of Syria. Their statements are not heavily laden with Islamist slogans, except for the introduction and the conclusion, which is always Allah Akbar something, right? But there is not a lot of Islamist rhetoric inside these statements. And but the FSA is drawn from the people, right? And the people, there's a lot of pious people living in Syria, right? So you'd expect those people to show up in these formations. And if you went to looked at the Confederate Army or the Army of Northern or the Army of the Potomac in 1863, you would have seen a lot of guys that looked like Christian fundamentalists, right? And there was a lot of prayer activity and stuff, but it didn't mean that was what the Civil War was about.
Okay, very good. Let's open the discussion for your questions. We'll start in the way back. Dave Schenker, if you could take a mic, make sure you identify yourselves. I'd appreciate it.
Am I good? Thanks a lot. Jeff and Andrew, we heard from Jeff that there may be up to 14,000 men under arms in the Free Syrian Army. Andrew, we just heard about 600,000 Syrian forces. Now, how many trigger pullers are there on the Syrians for the regime? I mean, obviously these are not Sunnis out there that are largely pulling the trigger and killing their fellow co-religionists. So, what do we estimate the numbers are?
I'll take a first crack at it. It is a lot less than 600,000, right? The General Clapper, or Mr. Clapper now, said in the DNI said a couple of weeks ago, or a month or so ago, that the regime had committed 80% of its maneuver forces, right? And so that's a lot. And if you start with the 600,000, you have to throw away all the cooks and the bakers, the admin guys, a bunch of people that aren't going to be involved in combat operations, and you start necking down to a much smaller number. I'm thinking the deployable guys within the regular military is probably 100,000 or less, and I've heard figures a lot lower than that. So it's not 600,000 to 14,000. Now but there's also the Shahiba, right, or Shabiha. Sorry, I don't speak Arabic, but there's a lot of those guys now involved in the fighting, and the regime is using them not just to beat up demonstrators, right? The regime is using these guys as regular infantry. They're committing them to battle in the cities with the tanks and the armored personnel carriers and so on. So the number game here is a little tricky, but it's a lot less than 600,000, I think.
Yeah, I would actually concur with that. The one thing I would say, though, as a caveat to that, is that we care when we, Americans talk about things like force-to-population ratios, of which there is no magic number for how many troops you need per member of the population in order to pacify. There's no exact science to that. But the reason we care about force-to-population ratios is in part because of our norms and because of our commitment to the laws of land warfare and the Geneva Conventions. When we wage counterinsurgency warfare, we wage a very population-centric form of counterinsurgency warfare, and that we try to isolate and control the population, but also to protect the population. If, however, you have different norms and you are willing to use more coercive means and punishment strategies that rely on air and artillery power, then maybe the population, force-to-population ratios don't matter for you in the way that they would for a Western force trying to carry out these types of operations. And unfortunately, this regime, and if you date it back to Hafiz al-Assad, has a long history of waging punishment campaigns against its own population, dependent on artillery and armored power.
Let's start on the far right in the back there, and then we'll work our way around. If you could identify yourself, please.
Yeah, Sharif Behruz, I'm an Iranian Kurd. There are rumors that there are about 15,000 Quds forces Iranian Quds forces in Syria fighting the insurgency. Any indications to Jeff? Have you read any reports or whether these rumors are true or not? The next question is about the Syrian, the Kurdish part of Syria. Is FSA has any presence in the Kurdish areas, or is the Kurdish insurgency separate, operating separately from the FSA, and whether any regional pressure from Turkey has to do with FSA moving away from the Kurdish areas?
Two good questions. Iranians in Syria, and is the FSA operating in the Kurdish areas?
Well, the Iranians in Syria issue, yeah, there are Iranians in there, but I don't believe the number of 15,000 is, I think, a huge exaggeration. I think it's much smaller numbers, probably very few actual combat type forces, mostly advisors, intelligence people, maybe a few military type specialists, but there's no, at least that I've seen, there's no evidence of a major combat presence of Quds forces, or for that matter, Hezbollah forces there. Some presence, limited presence, assistance type presence there, but nothing like 15,000. What I see in the Kurdish areas, for a long time there was practically no FSA activity that you could put your finger on. There were some political type demonstrations and so on, but not FSA type activity. Now we're starting to see attacks and clashes between FSA and regime forces in Asaka, for example. So it's not very big yet. Just a few incidents, but that's the way it starts in every province, right? You get one or two, one incident and a couple, and then a couple more. That's what we saw in Aleppo. So I think they're there, and I think they're beginning to emerge, in that part of the country. Basically, all the provinces are going to be involved in the armed rebellion before too much longer.
Can I just, while you're up there, Jeff, can you say a word about the government's, the regime's anti-insurgency strategy? Is it using the same division as the vanguard of this and moving it around, or are multiple divisions involved in going into major opposition zones?
I think it's the latter. There's been a lot of attention put on the 4th Armored Division, which apparently scoots all over the country to conduct operations, and it has been active in a lot of places. The 4th Division's been in Damascus, it's been in the Damascus countryside, it's been in Dara, it's been in Idlib, it's been in Homs. So at least in those areas, the 4th Division has been active. But in my view, what I see, every division in the Syrian Army has been reported as having been involved in suppression activities. That doesn't mean every brigade or every battalion has, but the 17th Division, the 10th Division, the 3rd Division, the 7th Division, go on and on, have all been reported to be involved in suppression activity. And we've seen cases like in the Zabadani operations in January and late February, where the regime retook Zabadani, or in its terms, retook it. They used the 10th Division and maybe elements of the 3rd Division. They used the Republican Guard Division in Damascus itself and in the area around Damascus. And in the end of January, one of the first big operations to clear the Damascus countryside, they used the 4th and the Republican Guard Division. It was like 30,000 troops involved. So this isn't a special one division that does all the operations and all the killing. It's every division. The Syrian Army is totally committed as an organization to suppression of the armed opposition.
Okay. Mona Yakubian in the center.
Thanks. Is it on?
Yep.
Mona Yakubian from the Citizen Center. My question question is around this issue of hearts and minds, and I'm wondering if both Andrew and Jeff could sort of draw out analysis a bit on how arming the opposition plays into that. So does it, for example, attract more people to the opposition because they feel that they're better protected, that the opposition is gaining momentum? Or because of its largely Sunni character, does it have the adverse effect of, in fact, repelling minorities, Alawites and Christians, and deepening the sectarian divide?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm gonna, I will, if I say something that sounds totally crazy, then you jump in because you know more about Syrian society and history than I do. My instinct is that arming the Syrian opposition forces would increase their likelihood of success for a couple reasons. First off, based upon my very amateur reading compared to yours, I think that the al-Assad regime has done a very good job over the past 20 to 30 years of kind of capturing not just the Alawi officer corps elite within the military, but also the Sunni business elite within Damascus and Aleppo. And I think who did the work on this? Bassem Haddad, maybe on the latter. And so there was this. I think what the administration was hoping for, and what a lot in the international community were hoping for, is kind of this soft landing, whereby the officer corps, the higher ranks of the officer corps, and the business elite kind of push Bashar al-Assad off to the side. And I think that was, if it was possible, I don't think it's been possible for the past 6 months, or for quite some time. And I think it may not have even been that possible, simply because of the degree to which this is not just about one guy. This is about an entire business class and officer class that's been enriched by this regime and whose fortunes are tied to this regime. Okay, so the reason I don't think that their loyalty to the al-Assad regime or to al-Assad goes up or down depending on what type of support the opposition is receiving. And I don't think fears about the sectarian nature of the conflict necessarily go up and down depending on what type of support the opposition is receiving. What I do think is that in terms of, again, when you're talking about hearts and minds, you're not talking about all things being equal, who do you support or who's nicer to you. You're really talking about, in my cold-hearted best interests, which side does it make sense for me to support? Do I stay neutral? Do I hedge my bets? Do I go all in with one side or do I go all in with the other? And if you believe, if you believe that the opposition is guaranteed long-term military and political support from an external sponsor, in the same way that the regime is guaranteed long-term external military and political support from an external sponsor, then that would increase their ability to exercise more control. That should increase rates of collaboration among the population. But again, that would all be very localized, and I would not only would I defer to experts such as yourself, but I'd defer to people who know specific towns and villages and areas of Syria as to how what that dynamic would look like.
Well, I think military assistance to the Free Syrian Army and the armed resistance is a very important part of the process to bring down the regime. It's not the only part of the process. I don't think there's a firepower solution necessarily for the FSA. Right? They will never be capable of meeting the Syrian army on the field of battle and defeating it in a conventional sense. Right? They can score tactical successes against the regime and maybe even move to maybe some operational level kind of successes, but they're just not, I don't think, going to be able to be brought to that capacity to defeat them in that fashion. But what the FSA does is it erodes the regime, it bleeds the regime, it increases its actions, create opportunities for defection. It's caused the regime allegedly to pull Sunni infantry from the fight. Right? It's causing recruitment problems. People are not reporting when called up for duty in the Syrian army. So it's a corrosive or erosive process on the regime security forces. And at some point, we may well see fairly or bigger kinds of defections and bigger breaks, in the Army. So, but just one comment on the hearts and minds, concept. I don't see that, really as, maybe is the way to think about, this. What we have is an armed rebellion against the regime, right? And what we see is that the people are committed to the armed rebellion. Their hearts and minds have been cast, right? And the regime's response is not some kind of, broad-scale counterinsurgency campaign. The regime's response is to kill the opposition at whatever level they think it's going to be necessary to get the job done. So it's something different than than the kind of hearts and minds struggle. The regime is not doing hearts and minds. I don't think. I think they decided it's firepower, and that's what they're going to apply.
I'm hearing you say that the opposition doesn't have to win, but their continued fighting helps ensure that the regime will lose.
Yeah. I think that's one way to put it. What I've said all along is we want to have, or we should have, armed opposition, political, sanctions, political warfare against the regime, economic sanctions, all those things to get the regime to break.
Yes, on the far left, right here.
Hi, I'm Steve Myers from the New York Times. Mr. White, you talked about identifiable commanders. Could you talk a little bit about the command structure of the opposition and in the various formations that you talked about, and also their relationship with the Syrian National Council with regard to the next one?
I don't know if you heard that. We'll make sure that mic works. The question was about the relationship between the armed opposition and the SNC, and about the command structure of the FSA.
Well, let's start with inside Syria, right, which is where the battle's really being fought. It's between the regime forces and the battalions and brigades. What we saw, I think, initially was the formation of these battalions based on defections, right, and a bunch of those, came out and so on. They largely operated independently. This led to, what I've called the lonely fights, right? One battalion or elements of one battalion against regime forces. But I think what we've seen increasingly inside Syria is groups coming together, groups affiliating with battalions or whatever, battalions affiliating with brigades, and the announced formation of actual brigades, and now we have these revolutionary military councils. Right, so what we're seeing is this emerging layer of command and control, or at least some kind of enhanced structure inside Syria. It's like within cities or within particular provinces, like Dara especially seems to have brigades. It has a revolutionary military council, and so on. What's not clear to me is, or it doesn't look like there's much connection between those operations and the Free Syrian Army, so-called headquarters in Turkey. And even though we've had sort of efforts to create some kind of larger military council outside of Syria, the actual practical on-the-ground effectiveness is not evident to me. Now, maybe they're doing more than I can see. Maybe that's going to emerge over time and get better, but I don't see it. So the center of gravity for the FSA is inside Syria, and I think it's the center of gravity may be moving to these higher level command structures within Syria. But it's very hard to tell. I just don't see a lot of connection between the FSA in Turkey or the SNC and operations on the ground inside Syria. Now that may emerge over time, especially if the FSA outside of Syria or the SNC become the funnel for weaponry into the country. That can influence, who has control and influence over operations.
Yes, here on the right.
James Vandervelde from.
Mike is heading toward you.
James Vandervelde from Booz Allen Hamilton. Were the administration become timid and daunted by feel the challenge of opposing the regime too difficult? Would it send the very wrong signal to Iran that WMD pays off, that it intimidates the West from involving itself in regimes that have WMD?
So what are the largest strategic implications of not getting more deeply involved? Andrew?
Well, yeah, I don't think, even though I talked about the security of chemical and biological weapons being paramount among administration concerns, I don't think that's the reason for non-intervention. I think that if there's any message that's sent regarding to Iran, I think that the message is sent by Libya, and that Libya makes the mistake, the Gaddafi regime makes a mistake by giving up its nuclear weapons program. And if you want to have an insurance plan against what do we call it, kinetic military intervention? I forget what euphemism we used for the war in Libya. But if you want an insurance plan against that, the lesson is to get nuclear weapons as soon as possible. That's what keeps you kind of a North Korea state that can hold the West at arm's length, rather than a state like Libya that is in which the West very directly intervenes. So I don't necessarily think the lesson is there in Syria. I think the lesson may be taken from Gaddafi's decision to give up his weapons.
So just to be clear, your view is that the possession of chem and bio by the Syrians is not a deterrent against international action against the regime.
I don't think so, but I think that it's got to weigh heavily on, as you start doing contingency plans. I mean, if anything, it may be impetus to intervene heavily on one side or the other as soon as possible to make sure that those stores are secure.
Right.
As long as this conflict goes on, and if it drags on for another 9 years, then those sites, which are dispersed all throughout Syria, become more vulnerable. And you've got to be thinking about, it'd be difficult. We have units that make this security of CBN weapons and other countries, part of their mission set, but it's very difficult when you have the weapons as dispersed across Syria or across a country as they are in Syria.
Can I ask both you gentlemen, if the United States were to decide that it did want to take up Jeff's policy recommendation, how would they do it? What would be operationally the best way for the United States to lead some international effort to arm, train, and support the Syrian opposition?
Well, I mean, there's a couple different considerations. One here is, do you do it clandestinely or semi-clandestinely or whatever, or you do it overtly and directly? I think we have the capacity to arm, train, and equip the FSA. Basically, however we want to do it. We know how to do it. We have forces that are quite capable in CIA of doing it, or special forces, other types of forces we have, in the U.S. military. So, the techniques of getting it done, tactically, establishing some kind of base camp or base area of operation inside Turkey or Jordan or whoever would be accommodated. You have to do that. You have to do things that we already should have done, in my mind. Like, we should have had people in contact with the FSA, finding out who they are, what they're all about, which units are capable and trustworthy, establishing communications, with them, establishing logistical paths for weaponry and so on to get into them, identifying what they can really use, what they really need. That's not, I think there's pretty good understanding of what they need to be more effective against the regime. Just organizing the armed resistance, helping them get their act together to cooperate more, building up the higher level command structures. Those are all things, that we could do to assist the FSA. If in my mind, if necessary, we could do it without bases in Syria, or out bases in Turkey or Jordan or wherever. We could do it directly from the Mediterranean. Now that's riskier, more costly, more chancy, whatever. It might take more time. But basically, it's not a military mission impossible to do that if the government is willing to take that kind of risk, and that relates to how important is the mission of bringing down the Assad regime, to the government. But we have the means. The better way to do it is direct military intervention, by some kind of coalition of the willing in which the U.S. is involved, where we use main military force, conventional force, against the regime's forces. That's the fastest way, in my mind, the better and more efficient way, and probably would give us more influence on the outcome. But we have the means. We know how to do this kind of special warfare and stuff.
Andrew?
Yeah, well, not for the first time or the last time. I'm in agreement with Jeff in some ways. First off, again, when we talk about for the past 10 years, our U.S. Army Special Forces have been involved in one of their two bread and butter missions, and they're on two sides of the same coin. One is foreign internal defense, so helping a constituted government, defeat an insurgency. The flip side to their mission is unconventional warfare, helping an insurgency overthrow a government. So again, we have the capability to do this type of stuff. Now, you may have read in the news that our special forces are a little bit taxed right now, and busy in another country a little bit farther to the east, past Herat. But with respect to intervention, I'm on the side of Jeff. I'm not a policymaker. I don't serve in the government, so I have the freedom to think in nice black and whites. And when you look at intervening in a civil war, if you're going to take Vienna, take Vienna. If you're going to intervene, don't intervene halfway, because the last thing you want to do is intervene in such a way that protracts this conflict for 10 years. If you're not going to intervene, then let the opposition lose. Let them lose. If you are going to intervene, then intervene heavy, intervene directly, and try to secure those sites as quick as possible and preserve as much leverage as you have. You don't want to intervene in a conflict that's going to drag on for 10 years, especially not with chemical and biological weapons dispersed through the country. And some, you may have also read this in the news, some pretty politically sensitive real estate just around the corner or across the Jolan. So again, in a very black and white way, I think you have to make the decision to intervene first. I don't favor an indirect approach to this because of the U.S. interests that I see at stake. And if you're going to intervene, intervene big, intervene early, intervene decisively. And if you're not going to intervene, then just take a step back. I think the administration seems to be opting for the latter, but then that puts them in a bit of a pickle, considering that the international community has said that al-Assad is leaving.
Thank you. Mike on my left.
Mike Spond, assuming accepting both of your opinions, what about the Kofi Annan? Did anybody believe this was going to be anything but a few days of newspaper coverage? And why did anybody even buy into it?
Gentlemen?
Well, I didn't think much would come out of it. And I think that's I wouldn't say that's a broad consensus, but many people, I think, looking at the situation in Syria closely, didn't believe he would be able to, accomplish a real ceasefire, get withdrawal of forces, and all and the other things. So, why do it, right? The downside of doing it is it's given the regime, some kind of cover opportunity to act even stronger. But it does, in my mind, it's sort of clear. The failure of that mission will clear away some of the underbrush, right? The people who are saying, okay, we need to work towards a political solution, blah, blah, blah. When that fails, the people who think that a political solution is viable will be, somewhat undermined or less confident or whatever in that. If there's some partial success, if there is some relaxation of the regime's operations against the people and the FSA, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you can get real monitors in there that restrain the regime's hand, there's nothing wrong with that. That will give the FSA more breathing space and time to get better organized and take some of the pressure off the people. But again, in my mind, it should be seen as though that should be what we should hope to get out of it, right? Not a true, solution or progress down a diplomatic path. We might make some, gains in terms of helping the FSA. But what should come after, when the failure is generally recognized, or most, partial failure, whatever, is generally recognized, then the attention should turn to the other options, the military options of assisting the FSA, and beginning serious consideration of direct armed intervention. But it's useful to, sort of say, okay, we tried the Arab League mission, we tried Kofi Annan, we thought that we could budge the Russians, and none of that happened. So what's next? There should be a what's next, and hopefully there is a what's next.
Rafi Denziger in the center.
Thank you. My question is also about external players. Number one, what are the actual effects of the sanctions, the ones that already exist and the ones that are likely to come down the pike? Number two, what's the role of Turkey today beyond providing shelter to civilians and to combatants, and what is the role likely, how is it likely to evolve? And third, with regard to Saudi Arabia, there have been reports about the Saudis providing arms to the insurgents, but Jeff says that the arms that they have are basically Soviet-era arms, which is not what the Saudis have, except for the, if I understood correctly, the odd M16. So have they provided arms, and if yes, who are those arms? Thank you.
Gentlemen?
Well, I think what most people are looking at this say is that it looks like Saudi Arabia is providing money and other states are providing money, but no clear indication that they're actually providing weapons. Now, in the world today, if you got money, you can buy weapons, right? More important, I think, would be if the Saudis succeed in putting enough pressure on Jordan to allow get the Jordanians to open up the Jordanian border to weapons smuggling and the movement of weapons. That would be actually pretty useful. So I don't see a lot of evidence of Saudi direct involvement in getting weaponry into Syria. Maybe it'll come, because this is it's a process. We're not at the end of it. The role of Turkey, the Turks have been real careful about what they've done. They've turned a blind eye to some things, but now you hear increasing talk about the Turks are looking at the possibility of setting up some kind of safe havens inside Syria. That would be a big step forward. The establishment of a safe haven basically means fighting or being prepared to fight, right? So it becomes a military operation. So the Turks are pretty conservative in terms of military activity and operations. So they have the capability, I think, to do it. It'd be interesting to see. They haven't done a lot in a long time, except in the Kurdish areas. But they could probably do that. They would probably want us in other states to provide them with political and maybe military cover as well. But I think the Turkish position is evolving from we don't want to do it to maybe we're going to have to do it. And the refugee flow, the clash on the border, or the firing across the border, all those things I think are nudging, the Turks in the direction of more overt involvement in the situation. Anyway, what was your first question? Well, you keep hearing that the Syrian government's only got X months left, so on and so on. I don't see a lot of effects of sanctions yet. It increases pressure on the regime, but I don't see it. In my own mind, I'm very skeptical that sanctions are going to turn the trick here.
Andrew, do you want to add anything?
No, actually, I don't. With respect to the first question, I think it's far too early to tell. With respect to the second two questions, I'm going to lose my think-tanking license for saying this, but I don't have the requisite knowledge base to address either of those questions.
We don't do that. Okay, 4 questions left. And so Jerry, Mike, David, and I can't even see the gentleman in the back. So we'll start with Jerry and work our way. If we can take 2 and then 2.
Thanks. This question is mainly for Andrew. Your friend wrote that article in the New York Times last week looking at Hezbollah supporting Assad and how that's changing kind of their maybe stance and popular support. I was curious about your assessment of that, number one. And number two, also looking towards CBRN stuff in Syria. Do you see that as something Hezbollah is potentially interested in if Assad continues to kind of falter? So,
Okay, 2 Hezbollah questions. Dave Pollock.
Thank you. There's a view that civil resistance needs to be, or could be at least, an important part of the end game in Syria. And for example, general strikes, mass demonstrations in Aleppo and Damascus, not just in outlying areas, turning the minority, that is the Christian, Alawite, other minority communities against the regime, the business elite, and so on. How can the FSA support that part of a revolutionary strategy in Syria?
Okay, why don't we take these 2 and then do the last 2? Andrew?
Yeah, I'll take the first question. There's been a couple commentary. Nick No wrote a piece for the Foreign Policy, arguing that Hezbollah has made this very subtle shift in their rhetoric. And then Ann Barnard wrote an article in the New York Times that thought probably did a better job of outlining kind of the pickle that Hezbollah is in. The bottom line is I think that this has been a very bad 12 months for Hezbollah. And, what some people may see as, a subtle and intelligent shift on their part rhetorically, I don't think is really cutting it certainly with folks in Syria, but also probably more broadly in the region. I think that they've been caught out by this revolution and have certainly suffered for not, everybody remembers exactly which side, Hassan Nasrallah, chose at the beginning of this conflict. And really, it's remarkable the United States dropped Hosni Mubarak in record time, when it comes to support for a proxy. But I don't think that Hezbollah really has that option from Syria. I think they're worried about a couple different things. I think they're worried that, on the one hand, any regime that would follow the al-Assad regime would probably have a different disposition towards Hezbollah. In terms of their arms right now, they've probably got enough arms to be fine in the event of another conflict with Israel. However, when it comes to kind of resupplying their larger weapon systems, specifically their medium and what we'll call for the purposes of the theater long range rocket systems, that would be more difficult. We have this established pattern over the past 20 years of Russian arms being bought by Syria with Iranian money and then shipped across the border to Lebanon. So if you're Hezbollah, I think you're worried both from a brand perspective and just you're seen as the party of the resistance, Muqawama al-Islamiyya, and then the real Islamic resistance is actually fighting against the al-Assad regime and in Syria, and suddenly you're on the side of the forces of tyranny. With respect to weapons of mass destruction, my thought is that if Hezbollah tried to introduce those into Lebanon, that in and of itself could be seen as casus belli for the Israelis. And so I think that would carry a huge risk for both Hezbollah and their constituency. What distinguishes a group like Hezbollah with a group like Al-Qaeda or something like that is they have more red lines simply because their fortunes are so closely tied to that of their constituency in Lebanon, which suffered horribly in 2006. And which has no appetite for another large conflict. That doesn't mean they wouldn't, fall in line and fight valiantly and support Hezbollah in the event of another conflict, but they certainly don't want one. And I think that the acquisition of those weapons that may cross a line for the Israelis, and I think Hezbollah knows that.
Good, Jeff.
Well, Dave's question is surprisingly hard. I think it's not perfect. It's not perfectly. Yeah, thanks very much. But it's not perfectly obvious, I guess, or perfectly clear. How those two things would work together, except in a general way. But there are again, what this the civil resistance piece should be part of the Syrian National Council or the emerging political leadership structures. That's something they should be heavily involved in. But cooperation between the FSA and civil resistance, we always see it to some extent in that FSA units protect demonstrators, or at least try to protect demonstrators. It's one of the things that brings on clashes. We see this all the time. It's one of the main actions of FSA units. Another thing that they could do is they could coordinate their operations and actions with civil resistance stuff. Like if civil resistance, moving beyond demonstrations, but to things like work stoppages, interruption of communications, blocking lines of like blocking roads and stuff, like we already see, the FSA could coordinate military actions with that to make both of them, more effective. And the FSA also could, and we see it doing, some of it, is it protects important services inside cities like bakeries and so on. It tries to protect them, from the regime forces. And we've seen a few cases where you had like the commander of one of the battalions in Homs, I think it was, where he was out making sure the bread supplies were being provided to the people. It's kind of a civic action thing by the FSA. And we know, and there's some evidence that FSA units in a place like Homs, particularly Homs, there was coordination, with the local political leadership on when demonstrations should take place, where they should take place, which, and so on. So there is, that's at least nascent kind of behavior.
Great. Last two questions, Mike, and then in the back. Yeah.
Sidney Friedberg, AOL Defense. Obviously this is a very different situation from Libya, and perhaps the key thing is that the regime seems a hell of a lot more solid, and certainly from looking at the French Revolution on, if the security forces are willing to shoot down people in unlimited numbers, regimes tend not to fall. Are there any signs of a crack in the regime, or of some place you could insert a wedge, or conversely of the disaster that Yakubi just talked about earlier, which was the Alawite minority as a whole deciding all our backs are against the wall, so we better support the regime no matter what against a de facto Sunni sectarian insurgency. Where do we see the regime support and its security forces? If all the divisions are fighting, do we see any signs of those cracks that look like the only way that this is going to ever end in a positive way?
Okay. And Mike?
Thanks very much for great presentations. Jeff, you referred to the corrosive effect on the Syrian army from the manpower side. Do either of you have an assessment of the pace of operations of the Syrian army, whether it's much of a strain on them, whether their maintenance is holding up, whether they're getting resupply from the Russians or perhaps the Iranians, i.e., what's the physical aspect of the Syrian army?
So these are actually complementary questions in a certain sense. Jeff?
Cracks in the regime. We haven't seen anything really dramatic yet, but we do see this stream of defections and so on. Some brigadiers are seen to be coming out more frequently and so on, but no major crack, I'd say, yet. There are some indications that the 5th Division in Dara province is having some problems, right? It's been involved from the very beginning in violent suppression of the resistance. There was some reporting that civilians were looting 5th Division positions. 5th Division has had a number of defections. They've been chasing Syrian security people have been chasing 5th Division defectors and escapees, whatever, around the towns, right? So there, the 5th Division looks, like maybe it could be one of those, that could break. But we have not seen any real break yet. But But it might be hard, this is something that might just show up overnight someplace, right? Like a division or a brigade or whatever just quits, fighting up in Idlib or in the Aleppo area. Yeah, it'd be very hard to predict that. The strain on the Syrian army, the attrition of its forces and equipment is not huge yet. There is a steady attrition. We have steady defections. We have reports of conscripts not reporting for duty. In my old job, we used to say that the Syrian army ate trucks, right? That their maintenance wasn't very good. Their stuff broke down all the time. I don't see that, and of course, my imagery source is YouTube, right? And you don't see a lot of broken down vehicles and stuff like that. But the regime's forces have been operating at a relatively high tempo for months now. We have reports of people not having leave throughout the period. People within important divisions and so on. So my sense is there is a lot of strain. But putting a finger on it and saying, how much and how close they're coming to breaking, I can't say.
Andrew?
No, I would concur with that. I think that it's got to be the Syrian military units have got to be under a tremendous amount of strain right now. What that strain looks like, we simply don't know. And again, this was a problem in Libya as well. We simply didn't have a good idea, at least in the open sources, of what type of strain those Libyan forces were under, which led, again, analysts like me to get the course of that conflict wrong as I was trying to, kind of predict where it would go. In terms of the regime, kind of the at the higher levels, I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which a regime can be living in a different reality than the one that we see. Again, with respect to Libya, the Obama administration met with good senior officials in the Gaddafi regime and explained, look, you guys, this is not going to end well for you guys. How do you want it to end? Do you, strike a deal right now? And they all, nodded and went back to Tripoli. What seemed to us to be the logical path was not logical to them. But on the other hand, and sure, we, in the case with Syria, we've got emails that we can read through to outline what the regime is thinking. But I'm not sure that the situation looks that bad from the perspective of the Al-Assad regime. I'm not sure that they think that they are losing or that time is not on their side.
Gentlemen, thank you for very measured and sobering presentations. And this conflict is not going away, and hopefully we can have you back later on and take another look at the military assessment of the situation on the ground. So thank you very much for joining us today. Andrew?